Hey guys, it's Crystal from livingwithgastroparesis.com, and in today's Ask Crystal question, we are going to address whether or not gastroparesis is a progressive condition. So stay tuned and hear my thoughts about that. So today's Ask Crystal question comes from actually a dietitian in Boston, a wonderful dietitian. If there are any of you in Boston who are looking for a registered dietitian who is familiar with gastroparesis, who is familiar with the Living Well with Gastroparesis approach, send me an email at lwwgp@crystalsaltrelli.com and I will definitely get you that referral info. The question was a question that one of her patients had asked her, and that's whether or not gastroparesis is a progressive condition. I really wanted to address this. I've addressed it in Living Well with Gastroparesis a little bit. I mean, there's, a paragraph in there about it, and I've mentioned it here and there on my website. But I really wanted to get into it because the more I was thinking through my response to the dietitian, the more I was realizing how many layers there actually are to this question. If you Google, is gastroparesis progressive, you will get all kinds of different answers. In general, and this is based on the work that I've done with clients, this is based on my own research, this is based on talking to some of the leading experts in this field, some motility experts. Gastroparesis itself is not necessarily a progressive condition. That doesn't mean that it can't progress. That doesn't mean that people don't experience a progression, a worsening in their symptoms, in their gastric emptying. And that's why it's a little fuzzy. But I want to go through 3 factors that I think might play into that. And I want you to keep in mind as we talk that there's still so much that we don't know about gastroparesis. So, these are my inferences based on what I've seen professionally over the past 6 years, what I've noticed personally, the research that I've done over the last, nearly 12 years. So the first thing that I want to talk about that can factor in is the cause of the gastroparesis. And a little disclaimer here as I talk through the causes. A, these are not the only causes for gastroparesis. B, not everybody is going to have the same experience regardless of their cause. So these are kind of generalizations. So if your gastroparesis is secondary to a progressive condition, we're talking about something like Parkinson's disease, scleroderma, mitochondrial disease. If the gastroparesis is a result of a condition that itself is considered progressive in nature, then certainly the gastroparesis and the gastroparesis symptoms may progress along with that condition. That's the first situation. The second thing would be something like post-viral gastroparesis, and this would actually be opposite. So in general, post-viral gastroparesis is thought to resolve over a course of months to years. 6 months to 3 years is kind of a general time frame that's given. So in that case, again, these are generalizations, but not only is it not considered progressive, it's actually thought to be something that will resolve over time. And of course, then there's idiopathic gastroparesis, which is just where they lump everybody who has delayed gastric emptying with no known cause. So obviously there is a cause, we just don't know what it is. So this is kind of the pool of people where experiences really are all over the map. And likely that's because we're not all dealing with the same condition, the same cause. Yes, it's all called gastroparesis, and we all exhibit delayed gastric emptying, but all that really does is tell us the problem, tell us the symptoms, tell us, what we're already experiencing. That doesn't speak to the cause. So some people with idiopathic gastroparesis will get better over time, similar to those in the post-viral group. Some people with idiopathic gastroparesis will get worse over time. Some people will stay about the same over time. So in general, causes can affect the prognosis, the progression of gastroparesis. A couple of other brief things to talk about. If you have an acute eating disorder, anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, gastroparesis in that case tends to resolve with refeeding, with normalization of the diet. If you have medication-induced gastroparesis from narcotic pain medications, from antispasmodic medications, again, that tends to resolve after the medication is withdrawn. So it's very difficult to lump gastroparesis into one group and give any kind of cut and dry explanation. So that's one thing. The cause of the gastroparesis can influence whether or not the condition will resolve, stay the same, or progress. The second thing, and let me give you a brief aside here, because to make this even muddier, symptoms can resolve and improve without the actual delay in gastric emptying changing. And I've seen this so many times with my clients. People will feel a lot better. Their quality of life will improve. Their symptom management will improve. Their dietary choices will broaden. But they go for an emptying scan and it's exactly the same. And that can be super confusing. Like, why am I feeling better if, my gastroparesis hasn't changed? On the flip side, I've seen people whose symptoms over time had not changed or had even worsened, and they went for a repeat scan and their emptying had normalized. So there's really a disconnect, and this is something I've mentioned before as well, and something that's really supported by the research, and most motility docs will speak to this as well. There's really a disconnect between the severity of the delay in gastric emptying and the symptoms experienced. Again, for some people, this does not hold true for everybody with gastroparesis, but there are people whose severity of their symptoms really doesn't seem to correlate the way it should with the severity of the delay in their gastric emptying. So I think that's something to keep in mind too. The symptoms can progress, and or the delay in gastric emptying can progress, and vice versa. The symptoms can improve regardless of whether or not the delay in gastric emptying improves. So just, a little bit more to confuse the issue. But at the end, I want to come back to that because I do think it's important when we're thinking about quality of life and our role in all of this, because obviously we have no role in the cause of our gastroparesis. The second thing that I want to talk about, and keep in mind that these are generalizations because that's the only way to talk about gastroparesis unless you're talking to literally one person at a time, is diet. And obviously you guys know that I talk a lot about diet. I wrote the book, Eating for Gastroparesis. But I think it's really important to think about diet as more than just a symptom management tool. And what I mean by that is, typically when someone's diagnosed with gastroparesis, we look at changing the diet as a way to decrease the symptoms. And that diet often becomes very refined, processed, high in sugar, because those tend to be the foods that we think of as most easily digested. The problem with that, in my mind, and this is, based on my experience working with people, I don't think that we have really any research, unfortunately, in this area so far, but when someone with gastroparesis starts following a very high sugar, very refined, nutrient-poor diet, there are issues that can come up. Things like bacterial overgrowth, things like vitamin and mineral deficiencies, B12 deficiency, magnesium deficiency. And these are things that in turn can affect the motility of our gastrointestinal tract. So if you are diagnosed with gastroparesis, you start eating a highly refined, high sugar diet, maybe combined with some treatment that includes antibiotics or something like that, and you develop bacterial overgrowth, that can then slow the motility. So most people think of bacterial overgrowth as increasing the motility, causing an increase in bowel symptoms, but there are a certain kind of bacteria that can overgrow and decrease the motility in the GI tract. If you decrease the motility in the lower GI tract, so if you're dealing with constipation, it decreases the motility in the upper GI tract, so your gastric emptying. So if you start with just, guys, I use that very loosely, but just gastroparesis, and then you develop just chronic constipation, you develop bacterial overgrowth, you develop anything that is then impacting the motility of your lower GI tract, that's going to affect the motility of your upper GI tract. And the problem is going to cycle. And I think that's something that we don't often think about, is we may be starting with just gastroparesis, and then based on treatment, based on diet, any number of factors, exacerbating poor digestion that then seemingly progresses the gastroparesis. So that's one factor. And that's why, in the Living Well with Gastroparesis group program, there are 12 classes, and 4 of them are on diet, and specifically on building a nutrient-rich diet. So that's a third of the class, because I think it's really important, not just for symptom management. It's really important for kind of long-term experience, like long-term outcomes. That's my belief as a health coach anyway. So that's one thing. I think medication can play a role in this too. And again, I'm all for appropriate medical treatment. I have a great team of docs. I have the gastric nerve stimulator implanted. I tried every single medication under the sun for gastroparesis. I absolutely believe there is a place for appropriate medical treatment. But you have to be aware that there are potential effects to that medical treatment. So there are certain pain medications, for example. There are certain IBS medications, for example, that can delay gastric emptying. So if you have gastroparesis and then you're put on some of these medications, it's not a surprise that perhaps, symptoms don't get better, because there's some kind of mechanism on one hand that's helping something, but on the other hand that's contributing to the delay in gastric emptying. The same can be said for proton pump inhibitors, and this is kind of a controversial topic, but there is research to show that proton pump inhibitors delay gastric emptying of solid food, and it's minimal in healthy volunteers, but who knows what the impact of that is on somebody who already has a delay in gastric emptying and then is put on oftentimes very high doses of proton pump inhibitors indefinitely. What is the effect of that on long-term digestion and gastric emptying? I don't know. But I think it's something that we need to be aware of beyond just thinking in blanket terms that gastroparesis, gets worse over time. And lastly, I would say that stress, coping skills, mindset can also affect our experience. And again, this is one of those things that, is a little touchy for some people to talk about. I think so many of us were told, it's just stress when we first got sick, and it can be a really, hard thing to look at really honestly. But if you've been following me for any length of time, you know that I talk a lot about stress and the stress response and the impact of stress on digestion and on our well-being. And I think there is something to be said, and I speak from experience here. If this is your first time watching me, please go back and watch some videos where I explain my experience, because I have been to hell and back with this condition. And so all of this comes not just from my work with clients, but from personal experience. I think there's something to be said for a condition in which you become stressed out every time you eat, and how that affects your digestion going forward. And it's so easy and so common for that to happen with gastroparesis. If you literally feel sick every time you eat, especially in the beginning, before you know anything about how to manage these symptoms, before you have any idea of what a comprehensive management plan is, if every time you eat you're feeling sick, you're going to develop some sort of anxiety or fear around eating. And if every time you sit down to eat, you're thinking, oh my gosh, I hope this doesn't make me sick, I don't know if I should be eating this, and you're getting in that stress state, being in a stressed out state automatically decreases the efficacy of your digestion. It stops enzyme production. It stops the stomach from churning. All of the things that we need as much as we can get if we have delayed gastric emptying, it stops them. So I don't think it's a surprise that over time, especially over time, as you're trying different meds, as you're maybe fiddling with the diet and it just doesn't seem like it's working, and you're just getting so frustrated and it feels like your diet is getting more limited and more limited and more limited. You know, I've been there. I've been there eating nothing but applesauce and saltines. That stress builds and builds and builds. And then, you know, the anxiety tapes start going. Like, is this how it's going to be for the rest of my life? Am I going to need a feeding tube? You know, and I don't think it's a surprise that over time this mounts, and over time it seems like everything we eat is making us sick. It's not our fault, and I want to be very clear about what I'm saying here. This is such a understandable reaction, but it's something that I think if we are aware of, we can start to address it. You know, if we don't even recognize that this is a factor, if we don't even recognize that this could potentially be contributing to how we feel on a daily basis, and again, this is one of those separations between delayed gastric emptying and symptom experience, because I'm not saying that by not being stressed out, it's going to improve your gastroparesis, which is delayed gastric emptying. What I am saying is that by not being stressed out every time you're eating, that can absolutely improve the symptom experience, the nausea, the pain, all of that kind of stuff. So I think keeping that distinction in mind when it comes to stress management, lifestyle, dietary stuff is really important. You know, I wouldn't say that improving gastric emptying is necessarily within our control. That depends on a whole bunch of factors, going way back to the beginning when we were talking about the cause of the gastroparesis. I don't know that that's under our control. In some situations, it may be partially under our control, but that's not the focus of my work. The focus of my work and the focus of things like the Living Well with Gastroparesis group program, that's over here on the symptom management side, on the quality of life side, on the things that we do have some sort of control over based on the choices that we make, going back to talking about the diet stuff, going back to talking about the stress stuff, the lifestyle stuff. So this was a really long answer to what looks like a very simple question. It looks like it should be a yes or no answer. Is gastroparesis a progressive condition? Yes, no. But it's not at all that simple. I think there are so many layers that go into determining somebody's experience with gastroparesis. And to go back to my experience a little bit, just for an example, I was diagnosed with gastroparesis in 2004, and my gastric emptying hasn't really changed. I've had, I don't even know, a lot of gastric emptying studies. The most recent one being in 2011, so I don't really know what's happened between 2011 and now, but between 2004 and 2011, my gastric emptying, according to the testing, didn't really change at all, but my symptoms were like a roller coaster. So when I was first diagnosed, my symptoms weren't that severe. My symptoms got really, really, really severe for a while, and then they got a lot better once I started putting together what I now call the comprehensive management plan and really focusing on a lot of the things that I was talking about today. Somebody might look at that and say, well, you know, your gastroparesis didn't change at all. Like, you do all this work, you got this plan, didn't change at all. But what I would look at between 2004 and 2011 is that my symptoms improved dramatically. My quality of life improved dramatically. So I think it really depends on what you're looking at when you're answering that question too, in some cases. Now, of course, there are people whose gastric emptying improves and their symptoms improve. Absolutely. There are people whose gastric emptying gets worse over time and their symptoms get worse over time. So there's not necessarily a disconnect between those things, but I just like to put that out there because I think that's a little bit of food for thought too, that even if the gastric emptying itself doesn't improve, and even if there's nothing we can do about that, you know, there is almost always something we can do from a symptom management perspective, and that comes back to the comprehensive management plan. So hopefully that was helpful. That was a long answer to a short question, but I hope that that sheds a little light for those of you who may have been wondering the same thing. I know it's a frequently asked question. Last thing I want to remind you is that the Living Well with Gastroparesis group program starts March 7th. There are still spots left, so if you're interested, you can head to gastroparesisprogram.com. You can get all the details, and you and I will spend 12 weeks together along with a couple dozen other people with gastroparesis from all around the world. We'll do classes, we'll have group support, we'll have live phone calls, and we'll help you put together your own comprehensive management plan. All right, guys, till next time, have a good day.